The dust in the clerk's office tasted like old paper and someone else's shame. Nora Hale stood at the back of a room that smelled of coal, oil, and dried sweat, her hands folded in front of her in the way her mother had taught her meant dignity instead of surrender. Around her, a dozen men shuffled papers and pretended not to stare. The Harlan Land and Cattle Company's representative, a man named Doyle with ink-stained fingers and a silver watch chain, spread documents across the counter as if laying cards in a game he'd already won. "Your father's outstanding debt to the Harlan Company," Doyle said without looking at her, "comes to $240, interest included. The note is now called $240. Nora had spent the last 3 weeks trying to count a path to that number. Selling the cattle got her to 60. The mule, another 8. The winter wheat, if it sold at a good price, maybe 30 more. After that, she'd run out of things her father had owned. "The property," she said steadily, "should cover the debt." "The property," Doyle replied, still not looking up, "is itself collateral on a separate note. If you read the original filing—" "I've read it." She had read it 6 times. She was her father's bookkeeper from the age of 12, and she knew exactly what the original filing said. She also knew what it didn't say, what had been added later in handwriting that was slightly different from the rest. But pointing that out in a room full of Harlan's men would be like shouting into a wind. "The terms on the second note weren't discussed with my father. I believe they were added after the fact." The room went very quiet. Doyle finally looked at her. "Miss Hale?" he said, his voice dropping into something soft and dangerous. "Your father is deceased. What you believe about conversations you weren't present for doesn't carry legal weight. Now," he reached for the final document. "Given your circumstances, the company is prepared to settle the matter without involving the circuit court. You'll work in the Harlan household at Red Rock as domestic staff until the debt is satisfied. Wages will be applied against the balance at the standard rate." Standard rate. Nora knew what that meant. At the rate the company paid, $240 would take 4 years to retire. 4 years in Jasper Harlan's house, which everyone in Colton County knew was a place women left quieter than when they'd arrived. Nora didn't move. She didn't look at the floor. She fixed her eyes on the water stain above Doyle's head and calculated what options remained to her. The door opened. The man who came through it didn't announce himself or apologize for the interruption. He was tall in a way that made the room feel smaller, wearing a coat that had seen weather and a hat pushed back on his head, and he moved with the deliberate unhurry of someone who had decided before he walked in what was going to happen. "I'll cover the debt," he said. Doyle straightened. "Mr. Briggs." "All of it." The man set a leather pouch on the counter. The weight of it was evident. $240. Plus I want a receipt in full and a copy of every document with the Hale name on it. Nora turned to look at him. He glanced at her once, briefly, then returned his attention to Doyle with an expression that made the clerk reach for the pouch without further argument. Her first thought was that she had been traded, not saved. Her second thought, which arrived more slowly, underneath the first, was that she was still standing upright and not yet signed over to Jasper Harlan. For today, that counted for something. Outside, on the wooden sidewalk in the autumn sun of a Texas afternoon, she stopped him. "I don't know you," she said. "Caleb Briggs." He didn't offer his hand, which she appreciated. It meant he wasn't performing politeness. "I have a cattle operation 12 miles northeast. Briggs Ranch." "Why did you do that?" He looked at her directly, and she saw his eyes were dark brown with the kind of steadiness that came either from honesty or from a very long practice of appearing honest. "Because I know what that Harlan contract looks like once you're inside it. And because I needed to act before Doyle filed the paperwork." "That's not an answer. It's the beginning of one." He adjusted the brim of his hat against the sun. "I run cattle and a small horse operation. I need someone who can manage accounts, read contracts, correspond with buyers. Your father was known as a careful man with numbers. I assume you learned from him. You assume correctly. Then I have a job. You have a debt to a different creditor now, one with fair terms and a written contract. If you want to hear the terms, I'll be at the Meridian Hotel dining room in an hour. If you decide you'd rather find another solution, I'll understand, and the debt will stand, but I won't press it." He left before she could respond. Pearl Odom, who ran the boarding house where Nora had been staying since her father's death, knew Caleb Briggs the way small towns know their solid citizens, not intimately, but with the particular confidence of long observation. He's been running Briggs Ranch for 11 years, Pearl said, pouring coffee that night after Nora had accepted the terms and signed the contract. Built most of it himself, keeps to himself, pays his bills on the first of every month, doesn't come into town drunk or looking for trouble. She set down the coffee pot. His men stay. That tells you a lot. What does it tell you? Pearl sat down. That he treats them like people. There was something else behind Pearl's eyes, something held in reserve. Nora waited. He had a sister, Pearl said finally. Clara, younger than him by several years. She married a man who turned out to be less than he appeared, and when that man died leaving debts, the creditors moved fast. Clara ended up in a work contract. Pearl's voice stayed even, but her jaw set. She died of fever 2 winters later. Caleb got the news 3 days after she was buried. Nora was quiet for a long time. He tried to get to her first, Pearl said. Couldn't move fast enough. There are people in this county who believe he's still trying. The ranch was nothing like Nora had expected, which was probably because she hadn't known what to expect. The house was 2 stories, solid and practical, with a porch that ran along the front and 1 window on the upper floor that caught the sunset. The yard was orderly in the way. Working places are orderly, everything had a location, nothing was wasted. The worn places showed where the labor happened. A dog of indeterminate heritage lifted its head from the porch step to observe Nora's arrival and then put it back down. Caleb's ranch hand came to take the horses. He introduced himself as Hector, a compact man in his 50s, with gray at his temples, and a precise way of speaking that suggested someone who chose his words carefully because he meant them. The stove runs hot on the right side and cool on the left, Hector said, leading her toward the porch. The pump in the kitchen sticks if you pull it too fast. I'll show you the accounts after supper. Caleb said I'd be learning the operation from the books. You'll be learning it from the ground up, Hector said, without apology. The books are only honest if you understand what they're measuring. She took that as fair. The first week settled into a rhythm that surprised her with its clarity. Nora rose early and worked through the daylight hours, managing correspondence with buyers in San Antonio and Abilene, organizing the supply accounts that had been kept in a system that made sense only to Caleb, and slowly rebuilding them into something that would survive him. She cooked breakfast for the 4 of them, herself and Caleb and Hector and Danny, a 16-year-old who spoke mostly in 1-syllable answers but could fix any piece of mechanical equipment he touched. The work was real. That was the thing she hadn't expected to matter so much. In her father's house, the work had been real too, but it had been invisible. Her father accepted it the way sunlight is accepted, without acknowledgement. Here, when she flagged a discrepancy in the November feed costs, Caleb looked at the number she'd circled and said simply, "You're right. I miscounted the late delivery." When she suggested reorganizing the buyer correspondence by region instead of date, he said, "Do it." He didn't explain himself in general, but he noticed things. He noticed when she went quiet. He noticed when the correspondence was taking longer than it should have. He didn't always say anything about what he noticed, but the attention itself felt different from the absence she was used to. On the first cold night of November, he came in from the north pasture with ice in his coat and found her still at the desk, working by lamplight on a contract with a buyer in Fort Worth. "The buyer's terms are wrong," she said without looking up. "He's applying last year's rates to this year's weight classes. You'd lose $20 on the difference." Caleb pulled off his coat and stood by the stove to warm his hands. "Can you write the correction?" "I already wrote 3 versions. The first is diplomatic. The second is direct. The third will make him angry, but he'll respect you more afterward. Send the 3rd one." She looked up then, and Caleb was almost smiling. Christmas was quiet. They ate at the long table, and Hector told a story about a cattle drive in 1882 that involved a flooded river and a borrowed mule, and ended with everyone alive, but significantly muddier than they'd started. Danny contributed a story about a mechanical pump he'd repaired in the dark, using only a piece of wire and instinct. Hector's daughter Rosa had arrived the week before from San Antonio. She was training as a school teacher and had strong opinions about everything, and she and Nora had discovered they thought at a similar speed. Danny, who had previously demonstrated no apparent interest in human conversation, had been finding reasons to be in the kitchen at all hours. Caleb, drawn out by the occasion, talked about the early years of the ranch, the first winter in a half-finished house. The summer a grass fire came to within 100 yards of the east pasture, and they beat it back with wet blankets. He talked around the edges of his sister's name without saying it, Nora heard the shape of the silence. After supper, she found him on the porch. "You don't have to tell me," she said, standing beside him with her arms folded against the cold. "But if you want to, I'm here." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he'd decided against it. Then he said, "Her name was Clara." He told Nora about Clara slowly, the way a man describes something that still has the power to cut if he moves too fast. The bad marriage, the debts, the contract that should have lasted 2 years but stretched into a third winter. He'd been saving to buy out the contract. He'd been 2 months away when he got the letter. "She was 24, he said. The wind moved through the cedar along the drive. "When I saw the Harlan contract in that clerk's office," Caleb said, "I knew what the second half of that story looked like. I'd read it before." He turned to look at her. "I know you didn't ask me to intervene. I know you might have found another way." "I might have," Nora agreed, "but I didn't. I want you to know you don't owe me anything beyond what the contract says. If you want to leave when the debt's cleared, I'll have the balance calculated to the day." It was an offer of freedom, so carefully structured that she recognized the architecture of it, built by someone who had learned, badly, what the absence of choice cost a person. "I know," she said. And then, because it was true, "I'm not thinking about leaving." Something in Caleb's face shifted, just slightly, like a door opening a crack. Then Clara was put away again, and they went back inside, and the evening continued. But nothing was quite the same as before. January drove cold down from the Panhandle with a determined brutality. The cattle work slowed and the repair work multiplied. Nora kept the house warm and the accounts current and found herself, to her own mild surprise, beginning to understand the ranch from the inside. The numbers in the ledger had become three-dimensional. When she wrote a feed cost, she could see the cattle in the north pasture. When she balanced the supply accounts, she could hear the creak of the wagon on the delivery road. She started adding notes in the margins, not corrections observations. Caleb read the notes and began adding his own in response. The ledger became a kind of conversation conducted in brief sentences across the margins of the year's accounts. One morning in February, Hector found Nora in the barn, watching Caleb work with a young horse that had been difficult since it arrived. "He's been at it for 2 hours, she said. "He'll be at it for 2 more. Hector leaned on the fence rail. "He doesn't give up on things that have the capacity to be better. He's hard on himself." Hector looked at her sideways. "You notice that. He doesn't sleep well. I hear him sometimes." Hector was quiet for a moment. "He's been carrying Clara's death for 6 years, he said. "He tried to save her. He was just too late. But in his accounting, and he keeps a very precise accounting, as you know, being too late and failing are the same entry." Nora watched Caleb move carefully around the horse, steady and patient. "That's not a balanced ledger," she said. "No," Hector agreed. "But some debts a person can't recalculate for himself. Take someone else showing him where the error is." She thought about that for a long time. A rider appeared in late April from the direction of Colton, and the message he carried made Caleb's face go very still. "Fletcher Harlan is telling the circuit court that I forged the Hale debt release," Caleb said after reading the paper. "He can't prove that. The receipt is legitimate. He doesn't need to prove it. He needs to create enough doubt to get the circuit judge to freeze the land transfer." Caleb set the paper down. "Harlan wants your father's 40 acres. He's been taking land all across the county the same way manufacturing debts, calling notes, running people off their property. Your father's situation wasn't unique. It was a pattern." "I know," Nora said. "I've been documenting it." Caleb looked at her. "For 3 months, she said. Every piece of correspondence I've seen from buyers and suppliers who mentioned the Harlan Company. Every account I could cross-reference against the county records Pearl helped me access." She crossed the room and opened the second desk drawer, the one Caleb had never used, and took out a folder thick with carefully organized papers. "It's not a legal filing, but it's documentation of the pattern." Caleb went through the papers slowly. Nora watched him understand what he was looking at. "You could take this to the State Land Commission," she said. "Railroad politics run straight through Harlan's land acquisitions. The commission has jurisdiction and a reason to act." Caleb looked up at her. "When did you put this together?" "I started in February, when I found the third account entry that matched the pattern I'd seen in my father's records." She met his eyes. "I was going to tell you when it was complete." "It's complete?" "Yes." He held her gaze for a long moment, and what she saw in his expression was something past surprise, a recalibration. the look of someone adjusting their understanding of another person upward. "We need to get this to Austin," he said. 2 weeks of waiting followed, during which Fletcher Harlan apparently decided the filing represented too direct a threat to wait for legal resolution. A man appeared at the north fence with a message that was less a message than a declaration. Pay back the Hale debt in cash directly to the company, or face consequences that went unspecified but were clear enough in tone. Caleb turned the man away. That night, someone cut the wire on the east pasture fence and scattered 30 head of cattle into the dark. They spent 3 days gathering them. Nora rode with the men, which she'd been doing since January with growing competence, and there was no discussion about it. She was needed, and she was there. Hector found her working a difficult steer back toward the main herd and simply nodded at her from across the draw. The second night, she found Caleb standing at the kitchen window in the dark. She didn't turn on the lamp. She stood beside him and looked at what he was looking at: the moonlit yard, the barn, the pasture fence that was solid again because they'd rebuilt it. "They're trying to wear you down," she said. "I know. It won't work." He turned to look at her in the near dark, and his voice, when it came, carried something she'd only heard from him in the Clara conversation, the stripped layer, the unguarded thing. "I'm not afraid for myself," Caleb said. "I'm afraid for the people here because of me. You, Hector, Danny. If Harlan decides the legal route is too slow, then we deal with it the same way we dealt with the fence," Nora said. "Together." "That's not a plan. It's the beginning of one." She used his own words back at him deliberately, and she saw him register it. "Caleb, you've been trying to protect everyone in the world from the thing that happened to Clara. I understand that, but you cannot protect me from risk by removing me from the decision. I've spent my whole life being told I was too young, too inexperienced, too female to be trusted with the real work. I am not any of those things, and you know it, because you've watched me prove otherwise for 6 months." Caleb was silent. "You don't get to take responsibility for my safety in a way that takes away my choice," she said. "That's not protection. That's the same logic the Harlan contract used on me." The words landed. She saw them land. After a long silence, Caleb said quietly, "I don't know how to stop trying to protect the people I care about." "I'm not asking you to stop," she said. "I'm asking you to trust that I can help protect us both." Another silence, different in texture. And then, "All right." Word came from Austin on a Thursday morning. Fletcher Harlan had been arrested on fraud charges related to land acquisitions in 3 counties. The documentation Nora had assembled had been, the State Land Commission agent said with the careful language of officialdom, materially useful. They celebrated that night the way people celebrate when they're too tired for anything elaborate. Hector found a bottle of good whiskey. Rosa made something from ingredients she'd brought from her last trip to town. And Danny played a harmonica very badly, but with complete commitment. Caleb laughed, a real laugh, and Nora filed it away as something she intended to hear again. The relief lasted 4 days. On the 5th morning, Nora was checking the condition of the south fence when she felt, rather than heard, something change. The horse at the paddock rail had gone still. The dog on the porch had stood up. 2 riders were coming up the western road. Not the approach of visitors, the approach of men who had decided something before they left. She didn't run. She walked quickly to the barn and found Hector. 2 riders, West Road. Hector looked past her, and his expression confirmed what her instincts had already said. "Get Caleb." By the time the riders pulled up in the yard, everyone was present. The lean man who spoke first had the manner of someone who'd grown accustomed to being the most dangerous thing in whatever room he occupied. He introduced himself as Sutter. He'd been Fletcher Harlan's partner. "The land acquisition agenda doesn't end because one man gets arrested," Sutter said. "The Hale property is still of interest." "Fletcher Harlan's in custody," Nora said from where she stood at the corner of the porch. "The fraud charges include his partnership arrangements. Mr. Sutter, your interest in the Hale property is now part of an active state investigation." Sutter looked at her for the first time. "And who are you?" "The person who assembled the documentation that's currently in front of the State Land Commission," she said, keeping her voice even, "including correspondence between Harlan and his business partners about the method of debt manufacture. Partners named explicitly." A silence. The second rider's hand stilled. "I'd suggest you consider," Nora continued, "whether what you came here to accomplish today is worth adding to the record that already exists." Sutter studied her for a long moment. Then he looked at Caleb. Smart woman, he said. She is, Caleb agreed. Sutter gathered his reins. This isn't finished, he said, but the weight had gone out of it, the declarative that had become defensive. The commission is expecting a full report of this visit by tomorrow morning, Nora said. They rode out. When they were gone, the dog lay back down on the porch step. Were you bluffing? Hector asked Nora. About the report? She turned toward the house. I'm going to write it right now, so I won't have to bluff about it tomorrow. Caleb was looking at her with that expression she'd come to know the recalibrating one. Sutter came back 6 days later with 4 men, and the specific miscalculation of someone who'd mistaken caution for weakness. They came at dusk, apparently believing the transition of light would help them, and they misjudged the ranch's awareness of its own perimeter. Danny saw them first from the hayloft and gave the signal. By the time Sutter reached the yard, the situation was not what he'd expected. The state commission agent, who had stayed pending the investigation's completion, stepped out of the barn with his badge visible. Caleb was on the porch. Hector and Danny were flanking the barn. And Nora was at the upstairs window, which gave a clear view of the yard and of the eastern road. Sutter had apparently planned as his exit route with a rifle she had been practicing with since January and could now use with accuracy at the distances the ranch presented. Sutter's instincts told him to assess before committing. He assessed. And then, deciding that the odds had been rearranged in a way he hadn't accounted for, he tried to shift the calculation by going directly at what he'd identified as the primary obstacle. Briggs, he called. Last offer. Walk away from the Hale land and the commission filing. You'll have no more trouble. I appreciate the offer, Caleb said. But Miss Hale's land belongs to Miss Hale. What happened next was fast and ugly, the way these things are when men who've decided run into men who were ready. 2 of Sutter's crew dismounted with evident purpose. The commission agent called for them to stand down. One of them raised his weapon. Caleb moved. The commission agent moved. Hector held position at the barn. And when one of Sutter's men attempted to circle behind the house, the move Nora had seen coming since she'd watched Sutter's eyes track the layout of the yard, she put a shot into the dirt 3 feet in front of his horse. That was enough to stop the horse and, consequently, the man on it. It was over in under 2 minutes. Sutter was disarmed. 2 of his men were face down in the yard. The one Nora had stopped sat on a very still horse with the expression of a man reconsidering his professional choices. Caleb looked up at the window. Nora looked down at him. He was unhurt. She could see it from his posture, from the way he stood. She lowered the rifle and exhaled for what felt like the first time in several minutes. Later, when Sutter and his men had been taken into custody and the commission agent was writing his report at the kitchen table, Caleb found Nora on the porch. The sky was moving from dark blue to black. You had the angle, Caleb said. I've been reading yards since I was 12, she said. My father's store had 3 doors and 2 windows. You learn where trouble comes from before it arrives. Caleb was quiet for a moment. I owe you an apology. For what? For every moment between January and today when some part of me was still thinking I needed to manage the risk for you instead of with you. He turned to face her. You were right. What I was doing, the way I was protecting it, was the same logic. Remove the person from the danger by removing her from the decision. You figured it out, she said. You made it fairly clear. I was not subtle. No. And there was the laugh, the real one. You were not. The stars had filled in overhead. From inside came the low voices of Hector and the commission agent discussing the paperwork. Danny's harmonica started somewhere near the barn and immediately stopped, which probably meant Rosa had opinions about the hour. Nora, Caleb said. Yes. I know the debt will be cleared by the end of February. I know. So, I want to ask you, not as a creditor, not as an employer, what you want. She looked at him. The starlight made his face hard to read, but she'd had months of practice. I want to stay, she said. Not because I don't have options. The commission has already indicated there may be a formal role for someone with documentation skills. I could go to Austin. I could take the Hale land and work it independently now that the fraud case is settled. She paused. I want to stay because this is the first place I've been where the work I do is visible and real and mine, where I'm treated as capable of understanding the full picture, where... She stopped. Where? He said quietly. Where I don't have to be smaller than I am in order to be acceptable. Caleb reached over and took her hand. His hand was rough from work, warm from the evening air, still holding some of the day's heat. "Marry me," he said. "Is that a business proposal?" "It's a terrible, abrupt, unpracticed proposal from a man who's better with cattle than with words. And I'm aware of that, and I'm asking anyway because I'd rather ask badly than not ask." She turned her hand over and held his. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." They were married in the spring, at the ranch, with the hills behind them green from the season's rain and the cattle visible in the distance doing the indifferent business of being cattle. Pearl Odom came from town. Rosa stood with Nora. Hector stood with Caleb, and Danny wore his good coat with the solemn satisfaction of someone attending an important official event. The Hale land was merged with the ranch and became the South Pasture, which had better water access, and turned out to be excellent for the quarter-horse operation that expanded over the following decade, as the cattle market changed and the open range era wound down for good. The world changed around Briggs Ranch the way the world changes gradually, then suddenly. The railroad came through Colton County. Electric light appeared on the main street of town. The great cattle drives ended, replaced by stockyard contracts and telegraph orders, and a different mathematics of ranching. The ranches that survived were the ones that adapted, that understood what the land could produce beyond what it always had. Nora adapted. She always had. She corresponded with buyers in Dallas and Houston. She taught the bookkeeping system she'd developed to Danny, who proved to have a natural aptitude for accounts that surprised everyone, including Danny. She sat on the county agriculture board for 8 years and was, the record notes, the first woman to do so. Caleb learned to sleep better, not all at once, but over years. The nightmares didn't disappear entirely. Clara never fully left, but they became less frequent. One afternoon when their daughter Emmeline was 7, the girl found the cedar box where Caleb kept the few photographs from his earlier life and asked who the woman in the small photograph was. "My sister," he said. "Her name was Clara. What was she like?" Caleb held the photograph for a long time. "She was brave," he said, "and she deserved better than what happened to her." Emmeline considered this. "Like Mama is brave?" "Very much like your Mama." He put the photograph away carefully. "Your Mama had the same capacity for stubbornness in the face of a bad situation. Clara just didn't have someone who moved fast enough to change the situation first." Emmeline went back to whatever she'd been doing, satisfied. Caleb sat for a while with the cedar box in his hands. When Nora found him there an hour later, she sat beside him without asking why. "She would have liked you," he said eventually. "I would have liked her," Nora said. They sat together until supper, and then they went back to the business of living. Hector lived to see Emmeline married and Danny's first son born. He died at 78, the way he'd always hoped, and they buried him on the hill where the morning light came first, and the whole county came to say goodbye. Danny married Rosa, which had surprised no one since approximately the second week Rosa spent at the ranch. Their son James eventually took over the day-to-day cattle operation. Emmeline came back from university with a degree in agricultural science and opinions about soil management that Caleb thought were too theoretical until they turned out to be correct. On a morning in the autumn of 1931, 30 years on, Nora stood on the porch of the house they'd rebuilt twice and expanded 4 times, with the valley spread below her and the hills carrying the first color of the season. Her hair was white at the temples. Her hands carried the evidence of decades of work, the calluses, the small scars, the particular way ranch hands hold their fingers from years of rope and reins. Caleb came out and stood beside her. He moved more carefully than he used to, his joints making their accounting of the years he'd spent on horseback, but his presence was still the same quality of deliberate stillness she'd noticed in the clerk's office in Colton 30 years before. "Do you ever think about it?" Caleb asked. "That day?" "Sometimes." Nora leaned against the porch rail. "I think about the clerk's office. I think about standing there doing the arithmetic on options and running out of answers." She looked at the valley. "I never think about it as the worst day of my life, though." "No, it was the day that led to this." She gestured, a small movement that somehow included the house, and the horses, and the smoke from the kitchen, and the man beside her. "You can't separate the arrival from what came before it." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I still think about Clara on that day. About how many days like that I didn't know about for her situations. I could have changed if I'd moved faster." "You moved as fast as you could." "I moved faster the second time." "Yes," Nora said. "You did." Inside, Emmeline's voice called them to breakfast in the tone that brooked no discussion. Below, James was moving horses through the lower gate. The morning was expanding the way mornings do on good land, slowly, fully, with the unhurried generosity of a place that intends to continue. Nora had been handled like a ledger entry, assigned a dollar value, told that what she could do with her own hands and her own mind was less important than what she owed. She had stood in a room full of men who saw her as a problem to be reassigned and not a person with a future worth considering. And then she had built that future anyway. The ranch was hers. The life was hers. The morning was hers. All of it earned, none of it given. And that she had learned over 30 years of hard and good and complicated living was exactly the difference that mattered. Some debts are paid to yourself, in work and survival, and the slow accumulation of proof that you are exactly as capable as you always believed. Those are the debts worth carrying. Those are the ones that, when finally settled, leave you richer than you started. She went inside to breakfast. The century continued. The ranch continued. And on the hill where Hector was buried, the morning light kept coming first, as it always had, as it always would. The moment Nora walked out of that clerk's office, she didn't have a plan, she had a decision. And sometimes that's enough to start. The life she built across 30 years of hard work and honest partnership proves one quiet truth. Nobody can assign your worth without your agreement. The best chapters of your story begin the moment you decide the life you want is worth claiming. A small note for you, this story was created and fictionalized by AI, shared here for your entertainment, and with the hope that its lesson finds a quiet place to rest in your heart.